We've all seen the reports of floods in Pakistan and now devastation in Japan, along with drought in Russia, failures in local infrastructure, and oil in the Gulf of Mexico. But behind the headlines, below the surface, the implications of these and other water-related issues present a mounting global challenge, which is as intricate as it is deep.
Worldwide, over 5 million people a year die from lack of water, sanitation, and appropriate hygiene. Many of these are children.
A dire statistic today, but in the year 2030, it is estimated that 4 billion people, or half the world's projected population, will live in water-stressed countries. Obviously, the demand for water is immense and growing, along with a thirsty and hungry population.
In fact, agriculture is a leading competitor for water use worldwide. It's not surprising when you consider it can take up to 5,000 kilograms of water to produce 1 kilogram of rice.
As additional pollutants from agricultural runoff make their way into main water arteries, we continue to see dramatic changes in ecosystems and in the climate.
Changes in precipitation pattern, especially taken in combination with glacial melt, are going to change the predictability and the patterns of our water resources. We'll see more frequent droughts in some places and floods in others.
As this happens, other energy resources will be strained to meet the water pumping and transport needs. Today, for example, the water needs of Southern California consume about 1/5 of that state's power. And as we continue to soak up this precious resource, there could even come a day when water will become more valuable than oil.
145 countries share international rivers. This shared resource will either be a source of conflict or a source of cooperation between these countries.
Global economic and political stability could very well hang in the balance.
I don't think people understand how challenging it's going to be. We take it for granted that water is there, certainly in the United States, but in 10, 20, 30 years, we're going to see some shortages happening here, and also the quality of the water is going down.
Our challenges with water affect so many aspects of life here and abroad. And if we continue on the course we're on, the question won't be, will we run out of usable water, but when? And so, as Johns Hopkins scientists and policymakers, we work every day to determine how can we turn the tide in a different direction. Good afternoon, everyone. As you've heard, I'm Nick Jones, the Benjamin T. Rome Dean of the Whiting School of Engineering, and it's my pleasure to be here this afternoon and have the opportunity to moderate this panel. The video really does, I think, set a stage this afternoon for an exciting discussion about a truly global challenge that confronts us all. This is not about H1N1 or oil or healthcare or energy or the economy, all important things. It's about water. We have about an hour for this exchange. There are three critical components of the panel. The first is the panel itself, and I will introduce all of these individuals in a moment. The second is me as the moderator, but the third is you all in the audience, and we want this to be an interactive discussion. We didn't bring 5 talking heads in here to speak to you for 50 minutes. We want to have a conversation with you in the audience. This will only succeed if you participate, and to facilitate this, we have some microphone handlers out in the audience, and so when we get to Q&A sections, which we will intersperse throughout the hour, please raise your hand, and when I call on you, wait until somebody hands you a microphone so that we can everybody can hear your question and we can record it. Now, there are many ways that we could slice this particular issue. It's very big and very complex. So we decided to focus it around 3 core themes: the present, the future, and what needs to be done, and what in particular is Hopkins doing. So I would now like to introduce the panelists to you. You've sort of met them all already because their full bios are in your program, and each of them spoke, of course, in the film. So first, on the left, Ed Bauer is an environmental engineer and chair of the Department of Geography and Environmental Engineering in the Whiting School, and he is also the Abel Wollman Professor. He is a leader in the study of water and soil pollution and treatment options, and his research provides guidance for defining and managing environmental risks and how to interpret human and ecological health risk data. When the Deepwater Horizon spill occurred in the Gulf of Mexico this past year, Ed was called on by the media for analysis and by on-the-scene organizations for advice and research. He directs the Johns Hopkins Center for Contaminant Transport, Fate, and Remediation, which is now part of a multi-institution team studying how the oil spill affects a sensitive aquatic environment off the coast of Florida. To Ed's right is Melissa Aprisco, who is an environmental health researcher specializing in water, sanitation, and hygiene. She is currently pursuing her doctorate at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. Her research focuses on international drinking water, particularly household and community-based systems. She has done extensive work in Afghanistan and rural Ghana, working to improve access to clean drinking water in low-income rural populations. Ben Zaitchik is a climate scientist who joined the Krieger School faculty in 2009. Before then, Ben was at the U.S. Department of State, where he specialized in climate change issues in the Office of Global Change. In his research, Ben uses hydrological and regional climate modeling and remote sensing to study how nature drives climate and surface change and what else makes an impact, as well as how to forecast and calculate risk of weather and climate events. To Ben's right is Winston Yu, who is an environmental scientist now at the World Bank, where he is a senior water resources analyst for the South Asia region. He also teaches at the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. Winston has extensive experience working on technical and institutional problems in the water sector and has carried out projects and studies in countries including India, China, Pakistan, Ethiopia, and Bangladesh. Winston is currently working on a billion-dollar project in the state of Uttar Pradesh in India to strengthen and modernize the irrigation and water resource sectors, a job that includes institutional and policy reform, as well as investments in infrastructure. All that, and he has also played as a concert violinist for more than 3 decades, including a stint with the Boston Philharmonic Orchestra. Winston's our backup in case the panel goes really wrong. Finally, on the right is Kellogg Schwab, who is a microbiologist based at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, where he studies environmental microbiology and engineering with an emphasis on how pathogens exist in water, food, and its surroundings. He is working to develop new ways to make water clean and affordable for less developed nations. At Johns Hopkins, Kellogg is at the forefront of the focus on water as a critical international issue. Very recently, he helped launch the Global Water Program to foster collaboration among scientists from the disciplines of public health, engineering, behavior studies, policy studies, and economics. So we welcome our distinguished panelists this afternoon. So let's get right into the present. So I'm visiting Chicago. It's great to be back in Illinois. I got up this morning, went for a run, came back, had a glass of water, turned on the faucet, got in the shower, no problems at all, everything was fine. I don't really understand what all the fuss is about. I do hear about isolated events, oil spills here and there, droughts, tsunamis, but how bad is it really? Is it as bad as everybody is saying, or is this overstated? So I think what I'm going to do is turn to our first 2 panelists to just say a few introductory words to get our conversation going, and then I'll turn to you, the audience, to ask them some tough questions. So let's begin with Ed. Would you like to say a few opening remarks, Ed?
Great, Nick. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I also want to thank the organizers for this opportunity to be here, provide some perspectives, and of course thank you for coming on a nice day outside and coming to listen to hear about water challenges. My perspectives are mainly from a U.S. experience, and as the video pointed out, at this point we're sort of close to a tipping point. We have a lot of urbanization going on, our population is growing, and we know that because of the water cycle, that we have a limited amount of fresh water on the earth. And so we're at the point where a lot of regions have had water stress, certainly in the Southwest. We know that Arizona, California, Nevada have had to be very proactive about managing their water. Other regions like here, Chicago, we take it for granted that we open the tap and get water. In the East, too, we have a lot of water. But in fact, as we forecast the next decade or two, we're likely to see even water shortages in this area. And so to manage this water, we now have to come together and think more holistically. In the past, we trained people as either water treatment people for drinking water purposes, or we trained people to treat the wastewater, giving us wastewater treatment. And now, because of the water cycle and the need to really be more precious and preserve our water, we're really coming together. And that's what we're doing at Johns Hopkins. We're taking a more systems point. Also, as we look to stretch our available water, we start looking at other water, stormwater, reusing wastewater, recycling water, and all of this, what this means is that there's more contaminants in the water. And so as we move forward, one of the major challenges in the U.S. is how to deal with these extra contaminants that are in water. That's some of the research that we're doing in my laboratory and other colleagues that I have, is how can we best remove these contaminants and maintain that purity. Now, if we turn to Chicago, as Nick was mentioning, the water came out of the tap. Some of the issues that you're facing. Well, first of all, you're blessed with a very good water supply. Lake Michigan has been, a lot of regulatory activities gone there, and the water supply itself is very good. And one of the reasons for that is many, many years ago, 1900 to be exact, the Chicago River was rerouted so it no longer flowed in Lake Michigan normally and flows toward the Mississippi. So what normally your wastewater would go into Lake Michigan is now flowing down to the Mississippi River basin. But the main problem you face with that is that during rain events and storm events, because of the urbanization and a lot of the highways and roads and concrete around, you get what's called combined sewer overflows, and so you just exceed the capacity. And so raw sewage does indeed make it into Lake Michigan. So over time, that's certainly going to degrade the quality. And I know there's a deep tunnel project in Chicago to try to capture some of this water and allow for less of those events going into the water supply there. And then finally, just to mention also that in terms of the drinking water side, is that infrastructure, and that plagues a lot of cities itself, is the infrastructure here, the drinking water system and the pipes are many decades, if not centuries old, and as they decay and rupture, that's causing a lot of difficulties and challenges for the water utility. So as we look at the future, that's going to be a major challenge as well. It's how to deal with this infrastructure. It's very expensive to retrofit and repair this, and again, you can think holistically on best ways to manage that.
Thanks, Ed. Melissa, you obviously, from the introduction, have plenty of boots on the ground experience, certainly internationally as well as domestically. So perhaps you might share some thoughts about your perspective on the state of the present.
Sure, I'd love to. And I'd also like to say thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. It's my first time in Chicago, and I'm especially very honored to be up here on this panel as a student. And another really critical thing for me being here in Illinois is the connection with the late Senator Paul Simon, who had a huge impact. I had been working in water in rural Maryland, and it was in listening to him in the 90s and his impassioned speeches about global water that really got me starting to think about where do we fit in the water concerns around the world, and really led to me ultimately going back to Hopkins and getting involved in international research. So Ed was talking about some of the concerns about the infrastructure here in the US. Those same concerns are occurring in the major cities around the world, but in addition to that, about half of the world's population doesn't have access to piped water at all. So what happens in those communities? And that's really where I tend to focus my research. And for those populations, what it often looks like is that they are having to haul water, often on foot. It's primarily women and young girls who are carrying the water. It can be for miles and hours a day. Water is extremely heavy. And so typically what I see when I'm overseas is usually teenage girls carrying about 40 pounds of water, about 20 liters or 5 gallons at a time. That generally takes multiple trips in a day to collect enough water just to have enough for hygiene and cooking and cleaning, and way less than what we use just flushing our toilet every day. So over the last few decades, with a growing concern about global populations, there are many systems that have been developed to treat water both within the households and within the community level. But what we've really been lacking is the evidence around what's working and what's not, and how do we make those systems better. So that's really what I have focused on. What happens when you go into a community and introduce a new system? How does the community take it up? What's their history around water? Often their beliefs about cold water or hot water or taste. How is it best delivered? Is it best to work directly within the household? And there's a wide variety of factors that actually can impact how an intervention that may be very good in the lab will actually play out in the communities themselves.
Thanks, Melissa. Okay, so you're on deck. Okay, you're up next. But I'm going to take moderator's prerogative here and ask the first question. And I'm going to ask Ed, in particular. Ed, can you give us an update on the Gulf oil spill? I'm sure a lot of people are still concerned about the state of the Gulf of Mexico, and you've been following up on it. It would be great to hear your perspective on what the short and long-term impacts of the spill on the Gulf will be.
Okay, so there's both good news and bad news in that answer to this question. The good news is that microbiology or bacteria have been able to consume a lot of the oil. So at this point, we don't see any more visible evidence or very little visible evidence of the oil that's there. And that's because there are a lot of oil-eating bacteria that are out there. But there still are trace levels or low levels of the oil there, and we're likely to see a lot of chronic damages. And my research is looking at those trace levels. We have developed monitoring tools called passive diffusive samplers to be able to pick that up. You're hearing in the papers a lot about non-detects, but in fact, that's just because they have a pretty high detection limit on their method, and we're able to monitor for those. So we're looking at what the chronic damages will be and helping the natural resource damage assessment in the oil, or Gulf spill.
Great, thanks. Okay, so we'll hear from the other panelists in a moment as we go into the other sections, but I would now like to invite questions from the audience, actually for any of the panelists, and I will do my best to direct your questions. So when I call on you, if you can just wait for a microphone to arrive, and we'll do that as quickly as possible. Right here in the front. 1 second.
Is any significant amount of water destroyed as against contaminated in the various uses? Say, comparing it to oil, once you burn it, there's no way back. Well, if water is contaminated, it's probably expensive, but it's recoverable.
Okay, Ed, do you want to take a shot at that one?
That's correct. Basically, H2O molecules, they're there, and you get contaminate them in the water cycle, but it's a very small amount. And so at some point when our population continues to grow, we're exceeding what's called a sustainable amount of water. And we have to mine water, and we mine it through groundwater, melting glaciers, for example, and that would just create stresses, and it's a distribution issue too in terms of who has water and who doesn't. But we can, if we invest enough energy and money, purify water, but then is it practical to do that?
Okay, in the middle right here.
Obviously, there's a lot of salt water on the planet, and my question is it economically feasible to try to transfer salt water into a freshwater state that can be utilized, and what type of progress is being made on that on a global level?
Ed, let me call on you again. I know this is right up your alley, so I'll pick on you again.
That's correct. So that's actually one of the techniques we're working on in our department, is looking at how best can we purify water. And one approach that's been very attractive is membranes. Reverse osmosis is one example on that. But it still takes a lot of energy. I mean, there's a lot of salt water there, but it's an enormous amount of energy to do that. And then we have a brine disposal issue. That is, where do you put the salts that you concentrate? Because when you create pure water, you have to put the salts somewhere. So those are real challenges. And the countries that are doing that are the ones that really have no other alternative. So generally, membranes or reclaiming water from seawater is sort of a last resort because it is so expensively. And then generally, we undervalue water here in the U.S. So if we're willing to pay what we pay, our water bill in Baltimore might be about $90 or $75 a quarter, so only a few $100s a year, you're just not going to be able, at that rate, you're not going to be able to afford to desalinate ocean water.
I saw a question in the back there, somewhere, right there. And then I'll come over to the middle in a moment.
I don't think this is a diversion, but I appreciate what all of you say because it is so obvious. When I was at Hopkins, we had less than 200 million in the United States. Now we have over 300 million. We had 2 billion in the world. We now have 7 billion. And water, even in the Great Lakes states, is a problem, and particularly with pollution. But my basic question is, and I'm in Chicago with Milton Friedman, where a CEO's only responsibility is to maximize profit for the investors. Don't look at the future. And I think that we are in an economic ideology that prevents us from looking at the long-term future. I happen to be a strong supporter of ecological economics, which does look at the future and the future generations, and gives us ability to respond to your issues. But our traditional quick investor profit and look good on Wall Street is a problem for us. I'm sorry, I put politics in there, but I'd like to know how that fits in with your thinking.
Winston, that sounds like a good question for you.
Thanks. Well, I mean, you've said a lot, and if I can maybe take apart some of the things you've said. First of all, privatization is a big issue, not just in the United States in terms of running and managing public utilities, but also in the developing world. And I think the thing to remember is that water supply, it's expensive. My panelists here know probably better than I that it's very expensive to transport water. It's extremely energy intensive. As you saw in the video, California's energy use, a lot of that is just for transportation. So we have an issue about how do these systems remain fiscally sustainable. In the United States, where we clearly do not pay to cover the cost to operate, maintain, and expand to meet future demands, we're in a real conundrum. And this becomes even more difficult when you start to look in the developing world, where collection rates are even worse, infrastructure is in worse shape, and the capital investment is just not there. So that's one aspect of one of the issues you've raised. On the second, I think the international community is finally recognizing that water has an economic value, and that we should value it for the different purposes, not only because it provides us water for municipal supplies, but also ecological services. And various countries are trying to design policies and programs to better align these economic incentives. So I don't know if I've addressed everything you've said, but those are sort of two things I just wanted to respond to.
Thanks, Winston. There was a question in the back. You still have your question?
Yes, I do.
Yep.
Thank you for this opportunity to ask this panel of experts. But every day we're hearing what's happening in Japan, and now that water has apparently been contaminated with radiation from one of the nuclear plants. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of that environmentally, I guess, for consumption, and will that continue?
Kellogg, can I bring you in on this one?
Sure. Thank you again, Nick, for having us here. And that question actually is very interesting because it's dynamic. We don't know exactly what's going on, but we do know that isotopes have been found in the seawater, and they spend a lot of time in Japan trying to cool down basically something that could have gone out of control. So they put an effort into pouring water in to a containment facility that wasn't completely contained, and now they're dealing with it. And I just heard today they're going to bring in a giant barge to pump the water out and store into a giant barge. Well, the half-life of these radioisotopes becomes the question. In certain isotopes, there are short half-lives where we can just kind of wait it out, and other ones are longer. We're talking decades to tens of thousands of years in potential. So the long-term ramifications is still unknown. When a nuclear power plant executive says the plutonium is outside the plant, but don't worry, it's not a problem for public health, that's a question we might want to say, well, how do you suppose that could be? One of the things that might be is that we do divert water away to contain it. Right now it's in a containing situation to prevent even more devastation that occurred. What we will have to do as a society and as an entire group of workers and researchers is together try to solve this problem because it's there. Now, preparedness is one of the things we work strongly on, so we'd like to prevent things in the future. That's some of the things we're doing, is actually going there to study what can prevent this from happening elsewhere. But at the same time, we do have this issue, and we do know it's a concern. It's also going airborne. It's getting in the food, so there's an agricultural issue there as well. And my understanding is right now it's not as severe as it could be, but we don't know yet.
Thanks. Let me go right over to the far side. I want to make sure that I...
As a biochemist who has just taught about photosynthesis to his undergraduates at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, I would like to give a more detailed answer to the first question that was asked. And if you can't remember what the first question asked was, it was whether or not there was any process that destroyed water. And as a matter of fact, within the biosphere, there is, because water is converted to oxygen in the process of photosynthesis. However, there is an offsetting process of respiration, both in plant cells and animal cells. So overall, I would not quibble with the answer that our panel of experts gave, because I'd like to think about the fact that there's a wash within the biosphere between the offsetting processes of photosynthesis and respiration. But I did want to fill in a bit of detail. And I see that I'm getting some nods from the panel, so I guess I'm not too far off.
Thank you for that clarification. Actually, we can bring another chair up if...
Well, thank you for the kind invitation, but I think I'm more comfortable as an audience member.
Okay.
It would be a busman's holiday for me to be up there.
Okay, one last question in the back there, and then we need to move on, but there'll be time for additional questions at the end.
Good afternoon. Some parts of this question has been addressed, but I guess I'm concerned is how enlightened are we as a planet regarding this issue? We've talked a lot about climate changes, so I guess when I heard speakers talk about there were some international countries working together, I was wondering with whom are they working? But basically, how enlightened are we around the planet about this problem of water? And one of the things, I guess it could be construed as a conspiracy theory, I'm hearing about a water cartel, meaning that there is a lot, well, I don't know if it's a lot, but some given to control of water, even asking if you'd like to invest in certain things. But the first question is really my concern.
Okay, so the second part of your question, I'm going to put a hold on because we're going to talk about the future in a moment, and we'll get some input on that. But for the first part, Melissa, you've been sort of out around the world. You've seen what things that are going on. You want to take a crack at that one?
Sure, it also ties into some climate change issues, but I think around the world there's certainly a very high awareness of the concerns around water, and in any country you go to, one of the first questions that they're talking about is water, and along with energy, certainly. But in Afghanistan, for example, when I was there, any community that you went into, the most remote community that you could go into, that they would be asking about water and how can we improve the water, and around the globe, how to get the coordination around the subject is really the challenge. We have a lot of global expertise in international organizations like the World Bank, UN agencies that are really trying to create the policy and the framework for countries to develop their systems. So there's one level, then there are state levels, and there are politics at that level, and then the community level. So getting the levels to speak across so that you can actually create change for the households. I tend to focus back down at the household level and how is it impacting the populations at the ground level. But it really takes the coordination across all of those levels to develop systems that can be sustainable. So I'm not sure I'm giving a solid response to that, but it's complicated. It takes concerted effort on all parts, and particularly it takes the political will to move any of the systems forward. So.
Thanks. Okay, so we're now going to move on to the second part. I know you've got many more questions, but we should move along. So I'd like to start thinking about the future. I think we've established that there is probably some cause for concern now, but what does the future hold? Do we need to be? Can we go to bed tonight and sleep, not worrying that there is going to be a water war breaking out somewhere around the world overnight? So. To warm us up on this topic, I'm going to turn first to Winston and then to Ben to make a few introductory comments. And Ben in particular, I will ask him to speak a little bit about this issue that we hear about from time to time, climate change. So Winston, perhaps you first and then back to Ben.
Okay, thank you, Dean Jones. Well, water wars. I mean, talking about the future of water is interesting because all we have is our imagination of what tomorrow will look like. But I'm sure many of you have heard Kofi Annan say, the future of wars will be over water. Have we reached peak water, as they say? This analogy between water and oil is compelling. And I think to dissect this question, I want to start with a premise, which is rivers are political systems. Okay, what I mean by that is that the boundaries with which we as human societies govern often do not align with the hydrologic boundaries that are governed by physics and science. And it is this mismatch, between the human systems and the natural systems that creates a shared interdependency, whether it's between communities, between states, or between nations. It is this interdependency that makes the management of water resources an extremely difficult, challenging, and political issue. And if you think about the examples worldwide, there's lots of examples. You've got the Indus between India and Pakistan. You've got the Tigris-Euphrates between Syria, Turkey, and Iraq. The Jordan River between Jordan, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon. You've got, even in this country, the Columbia River, which we share with Canada, and the Colorado that we share with Mexico. So this idea that water inherently is a source of tension is not a new idea. And I know my panel members know that I love the word rivalry. I know it sounds strange, but I love this word because if you go back to the Latin root for the word rivalry, rivalis. What does rivalis mean? Well, rivalis means one who shares the same stream, which suggests that somewhere in this idea of rivalry, conflict, tension, that somehow water is a part of this. So what does this mean for the future? Well, the question that we're looking at SICE is, to what degree does this interdependency between nations limit the ability for countries to be water secure? And what I mean by water secure is two things. First of all, we know that water is a productive asset, that we need it for our economies, that we need it for life, that we need it for livelihoods. But we also know that water plays a destructive role in our lives. The same power that is generating hydroelectricity is that power that in many cases can destroy lives, can destroy whole communities. You don't have to look very far beyond the past decade to see examples of floods, cyclones, and even droughts that have wreaked havoc. So the real question is to what extent, again, does this interdependency between communities, between states, between countries, limit the ability of these governance systems to both maximize the productive role that water plays and minimize the destructive role that water can play? And so as we start to think about the future, you ask yourself, well, is this a big international issue? Well, as you saw in the video, 145 countries share international rivers. Just think about the Danube. The Danube is shared by 17 countries. So can you imagine these 17 countries trying to discuss, negotiate, collaborate, coordinate, make decisions about this river? Not only are they having to balance their own national objectives and national interests, but they must also balance the interests of their neighbors. And so one of the things we're interested in CICE is that if we think into the future, there's two options here. One is to what extent do these international rivers serve as lightning rods for future tension, for future conflict, or what I am most hopeful about and what I think is the more likely outcome is to what extent do these international rivers serve as an opportunity for countries to collaborate and build up cooperative relationships. Thank you.
Thanks, Winston. Ben.
Yeah, thank you. So I think in thinking about climate change, since that's my charge here, most frequently when people talk about climate change and when it's discussed in general terms, we talk in terms of temperature increase, global warming. You'll hear numbers saying things like the global average temperature will increase by 3 to 6 degrees over the next 100 years if we don't mitigate our emissions of fossil fuels. And it's an interesting number, but it's not really the story of what the impacts of climate change are. And what are the impacts of climate change? Well, when we talk about how climate affects us, it's often in terms of the hydrologic cycle, of changes in water, and changes in how water moves and how water is stored. And so when you talk about the predictions of climate change that might be relevant to how climate will impact us, we can look at, people talk about uncertainty, but there are certain very robust elements of the climate forecast. One thing is, as you put more energy into the system, you will tend to accelerate the hydrologic cycle. In a lot of ways, the Earth is just a big heat engine made to move water. We're going to start moving water faster, which means that dry places become drier, wet places become wetter. The other thing we know is that when you heat up air, it is able to hold more water. So there's more water vapor in the air. It ain't the heat, it's the humidity. And so you're going to have a lot of water vapor in the air, which then provides power for very powerful storms. And so you're going to see more extreme events, more floods, more large thunderstorms, and other kinds of intense hydrological events hitting us, alternating with droughts. And so as you'll see, you might have a very intense rain event, which then cleans all the water vapor out of the air, followed by a long dry period under warmer temperatures. So even if you receive the precipitation, because of the way it came, you could then be affected by drought shortly thereafter. And all of this contributes to an increasing variability, and a variability in the accessibility of our water sources, our water resources, due to climate change. And the idea of variability is certainly not new. It's an ancient thing. Certainly during Earl's presentation, I was thinking I should go take a look at some of these documents because we know our most ancient stories are about this. We have the Babylonian legend of Gilgamesh. When the gods decide to punish Gilgamesh, they send the bull of heaven. And the bull of heaven is an intense drought that decimates its population. That drought was not anticipated. Gilgamesh didn't know the gods were angry. And so this created a big problem for him. You can then contrast that to the great progress that was made by the time the Bible was written, and Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams and predicts 7 years in advance that we're going to have 7 years of wet conditions followed by 7 years of drought. And so it's time to stockpile. And this worked out very well for Egypt at that time, as we're told in the Bible. And so there was variability then, but the ability to anticipate that variability, to build your resilience to it, ended in an entirely different result. And so we might say that, well, today, of course, we're very resilient, we're very robust. Why would we worry about it? The video at the beginning discussed some of the odd weather that was seen last summer with the floods in Pakistan, the drought in Russia, which led to forest fires and heat waves and such. Another element that happened last summer that didn't receive as much media attention here at the time was that there was a drought in the Middle East. Syria has been experiencing a drought for several years, and the whole Levant, the Fertile Crescent, had crop failure. When Russia shuts down its grain exports because of drought, they're one of the world's largest exporters of grain, and you have a drought affecting grain production in the Middle East, the price of wheat on global markets, and particularly in the Middle East, skyrocketed. You had a spike in commodity prices. Egypt happens to be the world's largest per capita importer of wheat. And there's an active discussion now saying, well, okay, some of what we've seen this year in terms of unrest in the Middle East did follow this spike in food prices. One might suggest perhaps this is a positive impact of climate change in this instance. But that discussion of how much was this related to food prices, how much was the food related to the climate anomaly, how much was our failure to be able to anticipate that variability and somehow responsible for what we've seen since, and is this a signature of climate change? Are we going to see more events like this? And that's what people like me study, and my colleagues at Johns Hopkins, trying to understand whether this event is at all representative of what we'll see in the future. And certainly as we look out into the future with this enhanced climate variability, a need to build resilience, we're under a lot of stress to do so. There was a recent paper that pointed out that today about 150 million people living in urban areas are in cities that are chronically water scarce. In other words, there's never enough water in those cities. And maybe another 800 to 900 million live in cities that are seasonally water scarce. So you have enough water at some point in the season, but not in the other part of the year. Due to primarily demographic projections, overlain with climate change, we're looking at that number going to over 1 billion people in perennially water scarce cities and over 3 billion people in seasonally water scarce cities by 2050. And that's the stress that ends up putting on infrastructure, on delivery of water systems, let alone, that's not even talking about variability, not even talking about storms, not even talking about agricultural impacts, is going to be an interesting challenge for us.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, floor is yours again. Right there, or just off the center.
Hi. So you were talking about anticipating and, possibly storing water for the future, planning ahead. But you were also talking about how different countries are sharing the same water sources. So how can you best plan ahead and get as much out of the water for the future for yourself while maintaining, without forcing global tensions? I'm just worried about, water war, basically, but I was wondering if you guys could help give me some perspective on that.
Winston, you want to take a shot at that one?
Yeah, well, that's probably 20 or 30 PhDs worth of knowledge. I mean, that is, what you've highlighted is the crux of the issue. Listen, negotiations between countries are seldom expedient. In fact, for instance, you look at Canada and the United States and the Columbia River and the treaty that was signed, that was about 50, 60 years worth of discussions to achieve two objectives. One was to create storage for flood protection in cities like Portland, the Northwest, and also for energy production. Okay, if you go back to the 30s and 40s, the Pacific Northwest was growing at a tremendous rate, a lot of industries. So there, the relationship between the United States and Canada certainly, one could say, was relatively normalized compared to other parts of the world. But even there, 60 years worth of discussions. So this is an extremely, extremely difficult topic. And you can imagine in places such as the Middle East, for instance, we will wait a very long time before I think these kinds of agreements can move forward. However, I do, again, think it is also a good opportunity. When I was at State Department, I had the good fortune to work with some colleagues who were part of the peace process. And in 92, 93, when some of the first accords were signed, they established several working groups on different topics. And one of them was on water. And this brought together Palestinian, Jordanian, Israeli, Syrian, and Lebanese water experts and utility managers together. Even after the process was falling apart, the dialogue amongst the water engineers continued. And I think it's a real testament to how important everyone recognizes water, and a testament to the opportunity to build relationships, even if at the political level things are falling apart.
Nick, if I can point out from an engineering perspective, that one thing that we're doing is, obviously because we have storm events and precipitation is up and down, is that we're making better use of storing the excess flow. And so we can do that by capturing our stormwater and doing treatment. And instead of building dams where we lose a lot of water through evaporation and siltation, we can store that water underground. So a lot of areas like Arizona, California, Florida are doing a lot of underground storage of water so that they can use it in a year or two when they have the less water supply available.
I saw a question right here.
In this country, we have, in California and Wisconsin, we've had a problem with draining of aquifers for bottling water. And internationally, in Mideastern countries, there's a double-edged sword. A lot of the money for making the purification plants and the water purification plants come from companies who are actually bottling the water there to export it in the form of bottled waters to other countries. Do you see any regulations coming on stopping, or is there economic discussions internationally about regulating bottled water so that it isn't draining aquifers in impoverished countries?
Kellogg and I have a little thing going about this. I knew somebody in the audience was going to raise the bottled water issue because this is a big button for Kellogg. Okay, so Kellogg, I'm giving this one to you.
Bottled water is an incredible challenge, and one of the issues that's going forward is what we value and how we value water. And I'd like maybe step back for a second and then go forward with respect to this bottled water here. And I would say to you as the audience, who here thinks that tap water is safe to drink? Just raise your hands if you think it's safe to drink. Well, some of you did not. Okay, how many of you brushed your teeth this morning? All right, oh, there's a few people behind you. How many of you used bottled water to brush your teeth this morning? One. That is an amazing factor. In the United States,
No, she didn't. She just said that.
that's okay. Quite all right. But in the United States, we take for granted this ability to have water coming out of our taps that's not going to kill us in a few days. But with respect to bottled water, the challenge is that people believe that sometimes this water is of higher quality or pure or things like that, when in fact, reality is that many places in the United States, this tap water is very high quality. Now, the rest of the world, that can be a challenge, and we're addressing that. And exporting bottled water, the amount of energy, if you start putting a footprint on this, is staggering. At hotels, there's Fiji water, for example. And if you take a Fiji water that's coming from an island that's transported and water is heavy, as we heard, it becomes really challenging to justify that in a sense. Now, controlling it in international ways is going to be very difficult. This is a market-driven, but perhaps we have to have a better strategy for marketing what we value here in the United States as an approach.
Thanks. Okay, far side.
So the hot button word you just said was behavior, and so I live in Wisconsin. I work with a lot of schools, and it seems to me that what my question to the panel is, and I am not a water expert, but behavior is tied to awareness, is tied to education, and I was horrified to be in a group of school children where we brought them to the university. I'm at the University of Wisconsin. We brought them to the university, and we were among scientists. We were very aware about climate change, discussing it, the science, so forth. And in this group of school children, not one said that they were being taught anything about climate change. And my concern is that climate change is becoming in K-12 curriculum like evolution is, and that the politicization of the topic is quickly becoming so sensitive that many teachers are just not going there. And so I truly believe a big part of our challenge with water is, first of all, the awareness, it's the education, and then it's the behavior change. You know, the water, water in bottles is a prime example. It's how we understand our behavior and the impact. So I don't know if anyone on the panel has any ideas or suggestions, anyone you know of doing research on how human behavior is actually impacting. Because I can tell you, in the Land of Lakes right now, we do have what I understand to be some significant water issues, some pending rollback of legislation that will affect the water quality. But I don't hear that pending concern or a concern of crisis that I hear you talking about that's coming in the very near future.
Ben, you want to comment on the sort of the politicization of the climate?
The education element. So that's a really interesting one, and the analogy you make between evolution and climate change is quite apt. In thinking about this, I think the way that I and some of my colleagues have been thinking lately is that the key issue here really is scientific education, teaching critical thinking at K through 12 level, teaching people to how the evidence-based process works. And I know that that's not a quick way to get people excited about climate change and to take that seriously, but the problem that we have, I think, is that without a firm foundation in understanding the scientific method and understanding how that works, well, of course, you're very prone to having people argue that, oh, well, evolution's just a theory, that's not, that there are other competing theories, and climate change, well, some people say it's happening, but in fact, how could we know? Climate's always been changing. And I think that it's easy to be swayed by that kind of argument if you don't have a sound sense of how to work from evidence to build your conclusions. And so I guess that my focus right now is not so much on getting climate change into the K through 12 curriculum, because you're right, it's just become politicized, in so much as making sure that children learn how to think scientifically. And then when they're confronting an issue like climate change or evolution or whatever the next issue is, they have the tools to address that.
Nick, can I follow up for a second on that? And it goes to, we have a mission and a mandate here at Hopkins, amongst other universities, and one of it comes from STEM, the science, technology, mathematics, engineering and mathematics. Sorry about the engineering. Where we as academicians...
This could be a long 10 minutes.
Okay. Researchers have to go out into the community and educate them. Well, just last week, Melissa Prisco, who is a graduate student at the School of Public Health, and some of her other students on their own initiative went to the grade schools around Baltimore and showed them the water cycle and showed them the need and value of water. And then it was 300 students that they impacted in over a short period of time, over 4 days, for World Water Week, which we went into World Water Week as World Water Day, and we extended actually World Water Month because we like to spread things out. So this is what we're doing, is actually getting out there and trying to train the kids.
Right.
And if I could add just a second to that, I was amazed at the questions they had. They had phenomenal questions. We thought we'd go in, we were concerned about, kids just sort of sitting there and not engaged. We couldn't have enough time for them because they were definitely excited about water, wanted to know more, and I think it is a great opportunity to go out and discuss the current issues. Yeah.
Great. In the 10 minutes that we have left, I'm going to go to the third and final topic, which is what needs to be done, and in particular, what is Hopkins doing? And I'm going to invite Kellogg to make a few introductory comments, but we want to hear from you also, because this is your institution as well, and we want to tell you what we're doing, what we're thinking about, what programs are in existence or in development. But we also want your feedback and your thoughts about what are the sorts of special things that Johns Hopkins could be doing. So Kellogg, maybe you could just give a little bit of an overview of what is going on.
Absolutely. I'll attempt to be succinct. So a few years ago, the Hopkins community was given the opportunity to come up with ideas of where Hopkins should go for the future. And I was part of a group that put together a proposal to Hopkins on water. And we developed a global water program. It was accepted by the president of the provost's office and has continued on with President Daniels, who's encouraged us to go forward with the global water program. Now, we have a strong history at Hopkins of engineering and public health. Abel Woolman, who was, and there was a building named after him at the Homewood campus, was an engineer who came to public health. And in 1918, he developed a system to provide chlorination for large pipes. And the chlorination was enough to kill the bacteria, not too much to kill the people. So our legacy, that what we have here at Hopkins, he was at Hopkins for 50 years. And his son, Reds Woolman, was at Hopkins for 52 years and recruited me, is that we can go beyond engineering and public health and get into the School of Advanced International Studies and into arts and sciences with climate modeling and into behavior and into anthropology and into applied physics laboratory to develop this team to start asking these questions. The behavior question was excellent. What we need to do is start with behavior. Start with those things before we start even going out into the field and get an understanding. So that team approach is what we're trying to do. Dogma is silo busting. And then from that, we've expanded it out to address these critical things. The triangle: water, energy, and food. How these things all tie together.
Thanks, Kellogg. Questions right here in the front.
Well, I'm a graduate of the School of Public Health, and one of the things that I really loved about there, and it was mid-career, so it was really a big sacrifice for me to commute there to do it, but I was very glad that I did, was the multidisciplinary approach to solving the world's problems. And I see that you're doing that. So I was wondering, one of the things that happened maybe 10 years ago was how much private funders, who seem to really work together now to have more of an impact, put the emphasis on tobacco cessation. And they did multi-state initiatives to bring awareness to the public. And I can't think of many places I can go where people are smoking anymore. Frankly, I take care of a Hispanic population where no one smokes. It's too expensive to even smoke now. So we have really made a difference in population level behavior. So I think it's great to talk about educating children but what about educating the adult population about the fact that, well, people use these little bottles of water because they were educated to use these little bottles of water. And so it's just a matter of massive campaigns saying, you know, look at what you're doing in terms of driving to a mall and all. And I mean, many people don't know that what you were saying about the parking lots and the fact that water doesn't get absorbed in that way. And is there anything going on in the country from the big foundations in that regard?
Kellogg?
There is. It's a push to go forward with this respect to water and that. And actually bring up an interesting point that with how do we address this from maybe an economic or corporate idea too, and integrating in there that it can't be just the government regulations or the non-government organizations and the universities, but we have to get this private enterprise involved in this in approaches and make them, the buzzwords are green technology and smart water, but they are starting to address that as a value system too, because some of this is going to be driven by cost. And if we're smart about it and are able to integrate in behavior, but behavioral change for tobacco, for example, they raise the price of cigarettes and things like that, to people valuing water, that is a good first step in there.
Other questions in the middle there?
My question concerns pollution in water. You hear about plastic bags in the ocean that are the size of Texas. In Illinois, we've had sewage dumped in Lake Michigan from Milwaukee, chemicals dumped in Lake Michigan from Indiana. I just was wondering, in terms of global pollution, what types of things is the university working on?
Ed, do you want to take that one?
Well, sure, I can address it a little bit. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we are looking at what these pollutants are and how we can prevent them. It also boils down to education. Again, here in the U.S., I think we're starting to realize that the companies that are making these chemicals are doing a better job at doing the green chemistry. We're talking more about sustainability, so these kinds of words are really infiltrating into our mindset and culture. I think that'll go a long way. Nevertheless, as the population continues to grow, we're going to see more demands placed on our water supply and, point out, the quality going down. So these will be challenges for us in the near future as well as the long term.
I think I saw a question over on the far side there.
And while you're getting the microphone, maybe for 1 second, one of the things Hopkins and we're working on is evidence-based, providing the evidence to what's going on in all these critical questions, and that is allowing us to have our currency of Hopkins to say, here's what it is. We're not vested one way or other, but we're able to communicate that to others as well.
Thanks. Please.
Yes, I wanted to bring the discussion back to where we started in the city of Chicago and the reversal of the Chicago River, and ask probably Ed, because there are a lot of people who think that Chicago is the poster child of bad behavior with regard to fresh water when we're pouring hundreds of millions of dollars down the shipping canal and into the Gulf of Mexico. Might be even worse than bottled water. And I wanted your comments on the city's use of water to keep the lake clean by this flushing.
Okay, well, I think from a one-set viewpoint, that actually is a smart strategy because you do want to protect some water supplies, and if others get dirtier and they're not used or exposed to people, then that would be a good strategy. I guess the pitfall here is that the water quality that you're discharging downstream, some of the standards have been relaxed, and I think you need to be enforced. For example, I understand that you don't disinfect the water, the wastewater in Chicago, and I think that would be a first place to start. So I think through regulatory management, if the wastewater treatment is improved, that would be better. I will say it's one advantage to be upstream, okay? So for Chicago, it's a good thing that, for Lake Michigan at least, that more of it is going down the Mississippi River Basin. And the people in New Orleans are used to this because it happens all along the way. So you're not the only city doing that, and they have a pretty good treatment system in New Orleans. So they've been able to adapt. And so again, this is, think sort of holistically, that we can treat the water, and so that it might benefit more people by doing what you're doing here with the Chicago River being reversed.
Okay, your questions have been great. We've got time for one last question, but I think you've been a little bit soft on the panel. So I want the last question to be the toughest question we've had. Oh, I've got 3 contenders for that. I'm going to go for the one in the middle, and I promise that the panelists are going to be around after the session and during the reception, so you can hit them up with your tough questions in person. But this better be good, okay?
Yeah, oh, yeah. Well, I'll start out with thanks first to the whole panel. Second to Melissa for mentioning Paul Simon, one of my favorite senators. And water was his signature issue, I think. And I would guess that you smile a little bit like his daughter, who's now our lieutenant governor, and also to, I think, mentioned silo busting, which comes to my first question. I've got 2 tough ones, so you can take either one. Do you think it's even possible to have a comprehensive index? I mean, each of you mentioned different challenges regarding water availability, quality. Would it be possible to even conceive of an index that measures globally and locally water quality, availability, flooding versus droughts, chemical and biological contamination, infrastructure, cost? Question number 1. Question number 2, somebody had mentioned politics and global warming falling into the category of evolution in terms of how it's under attack. And especially when you mentioned Rachel Carson, she's being attacked now by people claiming that she's killing people posthumously by denigrating DDT and thus making people more vulnerable to malaria. Do any of you feel, as scientists, that you're under attack for your views? Because sometimes you're challenging powerful interests. So either one of those questions will do.
Okay, so I think they qualify as tough questions. Actually, so for the second one, maybe we can just get a very quick response from each of the panelists, and then I'll let Winston close by taking a shot perhaps at the first one. So do any of you feel attacked for your views on bottled water, for example?
You betcha, and I love it. Because one of the things we have to do is provide evidence. And one of the things, the currency of Hopkins is that independent assessment. And it has been from the beginning to the end that's what we have to rely on, which goes in great to the talk about integrity. And it's not just the medical profession that has that need. We have disconnected somewhat from all our scientist disciplines and even behavioral disciplines about who we're trying to serve, what we're trying to do. So I would say yes, and bring it on.
Winston.
Well, my day job is at the World Bank, and yes, I am attacked quite often being at the World Bank. But I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think depends on where you're talking about. I mean, certainly in the developing world, I work a lot in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. There are lots of interests. And in particular, there's a huge institutional inertia in many of the places where I work, where breaking status quo is nearly impossible because of the political interest, because of the corruption, because of X, Y, Z. So it is a huge fight to change behaviors, to generate awareness, all of the things you mentioned, because it is such a complex question, and there's so many stakeholders involved. You can't possibly try to get all of them involved. So,
Ben?
Yeah, so in the climate world, there have been 2 reactions. Yes, you get attacked, and there have been 2 reactions. One is to say ignore it, do your work, and the other is to engage and have that argument. And I fall into Kellogg's camp, and I guess Steve Schneider famously wrote, science is a contact sport. It's good when they attack you, because what you do is you take your Johns Hopkins perspective, your objective, absolutely solidly done science, and you take advantage of that conversation to engage with those who are trying to deny the issue.
Melissa, I hope you're not being too roughed up yet, are you, as a
Well, I've gotten a little taste of it, especially as we're evaluating some for-profit systems. And so there are livelihoods at stake, there are profits at stake. So I've gotten some glimpses of it. And I think one of the things that I have learned is that as a scientist, we have to be very careful on how we communicate and be sure that we are communicating clearly, not nuancing our answers too much so that they become kind of nothing in there. And so I think that's been one of the challenges for me. But yeah, it's challenging.
Ed?
I'd say for me, it boils down to that as a society, we tend to undervalue water. And so when we try to improve treatment or put in systems to improve the infrastructure, we're really on a thin margin there. For example, cable companies and our cell phones, we can double the price for easily, we pay for that. But when people talk about even raising the cost of water 10% in the U.S., often those public utility boards are shot down. And so we really need to do a better job at being able to provide the funding for water so that we can help safeguard our future.
Okay, part of the thing that one learns as a dean is when there's a hook behind you that is about to pull you. So we're not going to answer the first question. You have to hit them up at the break for that, okay? So I am going to stop here because we are out of time and I know there's a show that's coming up. So please join me in thanking this fabulous panel.